As you've probably gathered, I don't like to create a lot of PowerPoints on things that you're reading about because I think generally you can understand what you've read and can ask questions when you don't understand something. But this week, I thought it was important to talk through the theoretical models just because there are a lot of them and they're not fully explained in the reading. They're kind of separated out by here's an introduction to the model and then here's a discussion of the different components of the models. And I think that's a little confusing. So I just opted to do a little bit of a discussion. I'm not going to talk about the third part of the chapter, which is on new literacies, because I thought that one was pretty straightforward, but I will talk about the first two parts of the reading. So our goals for this short presentation are just to understand the components of learning to write, which is what the theory or the theories we'll talk about, and then review the 5 models of writing. So the first part of the reading is this chapter by Charles Bazerman called What Do Sociocultural Studies of Writing Tell Us About Learning to Write? And this is from a larger book, but this first chapter I thought was really helpful in understanding what do we know about what it means to learn to write. So he broke the chapter up into the hows, the whys, the whats of writing. So why people write. The situation, circumstances, context, and technology are all kind of the considerations of why we write. So in the situation, we need to think about planning, consulting, gathering and selecting information, and also the audience. All of those are situational considerations. And then the circumstances. One thing I thought was really important in this reading was the discussion of how rarely writing is read across generations. You think about what you read in school and what you enjoy reading. Likely what you enjoy reading is more contemporary stuff. And that's just the nature of human beings. We like to read what we can relate to. So that's why teachers have so much difficulty teaching Shakespeare, because though it's relatable to students, it takes a lot of work to get them to see how. So I thought that was a really important point that he made. It's also important to consider why people write the context of prior texts. So often we're writing about things that are related to other things that we're reading. That's very true in an English class, but even if you think about the writing that we do in social media, if you read an article that you think other people that you know or are friends with on social media would get something out of, you might write a little bit about why you enjoyed that and then share it. We often draw in our writing on things we've read or watched. A text doesn't have to be something that's written. It can be something you've watched, something you've listened to, whatever. And then recently, technology has become a component related to why we write. We have a much wider readership now that we can connect with people so easily via technology. So we have this complex collaboration via social media where we're bouncing ideas off of each other and building on people's ideas and arguing with people. And then also we're being read by a much wider audience. I also liked that he titled this part of the reading Consequences of Writing, because consequences usually have pretty negative connotation, but here he's just meaning it in the sense of what are the outcomes. So we can build relationships through writing, we can gain a voice and identity, and it's interesting because that can be a double-edged sword. The voice that we want to present is not always what readers hear in their heads when they read us. So our voice is simultaneously being presented by us, but then also attributed to us by our readers. So that's an interesting point. You can also develop a sense of yourself as a writer through writing, and as a thinker, and as an individual and a person. I also liked this idea that he shared of shareable meanings. So when we write, we can create a definition of something and it can be shared widely with a large group of people. If you think about it, 10 years ago, there was no meaning to the word friend outside of friend as a noun. Maybe 15 years ago. I don't know. Facebook's been around for a long time now. But it used to be that friend meant a person. Now, friend is a noun. It's an action. You can friend someone. We created a shareable meaning of that word through writing and speaking. So creating content. And then the last part, these material consequences he talked about of writing, it's really kind of incredible when you think about it, how much comes out of writing. So there were things he mentioned in there, like buildings become built, social change happens through the writing of laws, students are admitted to college. I was thinking about the idea of houses being purchased because I'm currently in the process of purchasing a home, and a lot of the paperwork has to be written in legalese, and so there's a lot of really wonderful things that happen in life because of writing, and terrible things. I mean, we also write legal documents to sue people, to file for divorce. So there are these material consequences that happen because of the things that we write. And then the next part he talks about how writing gets done. So there's the planning and refinement stages. So the first stage where you plan out the writing, then draft it, then refine it before you publish it. So that's kind of what we think of as the writing process. He also talks about genres acting as a guide. So in a writing class, often you'll see expository writing, informative writing, which is, depending on the class you're in, the same or different, argumentative writing, narrative writing. The genre is meant to act as a guide for the writer. What is your voice supposed to sound like? How are you supposed to choose words? That kind of thing. And in that same vein, writing is also situational. And we'll talk about that more when we get into the other parts of the presentation, but students write in school very differently than they might write on social media, than they might send an email to a grandmother. Everything is situational. And so it's important to remember that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's important to remember that part of our job as teachers is to make sure students are learning practical skills in our classes, practical writing skills. All right, so then how writing is learned. Really, writing and just anything really that we learn in life is learned through connecting our prior knowledge to our new knowledge. So when we're in a new situation, we rely on our prior knowledge to solve a new problem. So that's the same with writing. Any new situation, any new problem that a student is presented with, they rely on their prior knowledge to solve that new problem. Often, writing is connected to domain-specific knowledge. So if a student is writing in science for a lab report, that's going to be very specific to that class, whereas if they're writing in social studies, they may be expected to use different sources, they may be expected to use a specific argumentative voice. So very domain-specific knowledge and the reasoning that goes along with it. They may be using the scientific method in science, and they may be using, the name escaped me, but it's a document-based support or something like that. It's a very specific thing to social studies class. Writing is also learned socially. Though often writing is an individual process in the moment where you're actually writing yourself, what you're basing your knowledge of writing on comes from social situations. There's something that he talks about called community literacy, and a lot of times in schools, students are asked to abandon their community literacy. So they may have colloquialisms, they use certain vocabulary that isn't deemed academic or school appropriate. So that code switching between what's appropriate literacy at home and what's appropriate literacy in the classroom, that all is very socially constructed. And then we get to the school specific part. So there's a component in the text where he talks about that students really are unclear of what teachers' expectations are with their writing. And again, that comes from this idea that they're having to juxtapose their community literacy with the school literacy. So students don't really understand what teachers want from them and often think what they want is arbitrary. From one class to the other, it's going to change, so there's no rhyme or reason to what we're expected to do in school. So that's something that's interesting when you think about how we teach students to write. And then I guess the difficult part about that is once students leave school, the writing that's required in their job placement is going to be different. And there's a lot of tension between what they learn to write in school and what they're expected to write on the job. Okay, so now that we have that background about where all this is coming from, let's talk about the theoretical models of writing. The first model is the Hayes and Flower problem-solving process. Then Hayes expanded on that model to include a wider range of psychological constructs and evidence about cognition. These aren't in chronological order completely because the Bereder and Scardamalia paper was written in like 1987, but that one's actually a lot more relevant in some ways because it talks about this idea that's gotten really big in schools of knowledge construction. So that's why they're in that order, I think. And then the Zimmerman and Reisenberg article is probably the most relevant to today, thinking about self-regulation and how students learn writing through self-regulation. And then the domain learning one kind of hinges on Alexander, but that's not really the main researcher that's talked about. But I like to give credit to the original researcher who came up with the idea. So we'll talk about those 5 and just kind of very briefly, it's all in the reading, but I just wanted to briefly go over each of them for you. The Hayes and Flower model is really important because this is where we get a lot of the vocabulary we use to talk about composition. So a lot of all the things that we talk about in English class come from this model. So we owe them a debt of gratitude for that. But it has 3 real basic components: task environment, cognitive processes, and long-term memory. And I'm going to use this to help you understand the word model and how we're using it. So when we talk about a mental model, it's not really tangible necessarily, but you could turn it into maybe a flow chart, or you could turn it into some kind of graphic organizer. I'm going to show you a couple examples actually in a minute, but I think that word can be confusing, and I like the Hayes and Flower model because I think it sets it up nicely. There's 3 components. You could kind of move them around so you could see what all goes into each of them. But yeah, I'll show you one in a minute. But task environment, when they first wrote about this in the 80s, really focused on external factors. What's the assignment? Who's the topic? What's the topic about? Who's the audience? That kind of thing. There's a technique you can use with students, or a strategy called RAFT, that comes out of this. Role, audience, format, time, I think is what the T stands for. I can't remember now. But it's those external factors. What are you writing for? The cognitive processes are those mental operations that are used. So you need to plan what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. You need to set goals to do that, generate ideas, organize ideas. You're going to translate those plans into written text, and then you're going to review to improve. So it's really the basic writing process that we think of, but the mental operations that go into that. And then they talked about long-term memory. So this is what we often talk about in education as prior knowledge. So what does the student already know about the topic? What do they know about the intended audience? What schema do they have about this writing that they're about to do? Okay. So just a couple general things to remember about their model. Very goal-directed. They saw skilled writing as conscious, demanding, and self-directed, and that's going to come back around. They didn't talk a lot about it, but this is kind of where that other self-regulation theory comes or started from. And then they also talked about how writing involves making plans, drawing ideas from memory, developing concepts, creating an image of the reader, testing the idea and text against that image of the reader, etc. So all the stuff I talked about, but just put succinctly. And finally, as I said, very foundational research, solidified the vocabulary that we use about composition, and a lot of research was built off of this theory. Hayes, from Hayes and Flower, in 1996, actually went back and built on this model to add some things. So to the task environment, he added the external factors of the social, so audience, other texts, collaborators, and the physical, the text that you've read, the medium that you're writing in, that kind of thing. So he just added a bit to that one. In the cognitive process section, there was actually quite a bit of revision, because instead of just thinking about it as internal to the author, it became reciprocal with the task environment, and then also added this idea of writers relying on problem solving and decision making. I also think it's really important to note that Hayes added motivation as a component, because motivation theory kind of blows up in the 90s and becomes, I mean, to this day, something that we as teachers think a lot about. So the fact that it wasn't in the 80s is very important, that he added it in the 90s. And then to the long-term memory component, he added linguistic and genre knowledge, and then also added working memory, which if you read later in the article for today, there's a lot more about working memory. So just a little bit more about it. This one was obviously more sophisticated and complicated, added the motivation theory and working memory, but the limitation of both this one and the Flower Hayes one is it doesn't account for how the writers develop, and it doesn't really provide any insight into how we help them get better at it. So limitations, but still very important research or theories. Okay, the Bereder and Scardamalia piece, this was initially a simplified version of the idea generation process in the Hayes and Flower model, but this became a really important piece when it comes to this knowledge transforming idea that is still huge in education. So what they said is that novice writers are just telling about a topic. It's writing as remembering, it's writing by pattern. You'll see this often in early elementary classes, even upper elementary sometimes, where students are kind of just following a template. That's what knowledge telling is. They form this mental representation of what the assignment is supposed to be. They draw the topic and discourse knowledge out of their long-term memory, and then they search for topic and discourse knowledge and transcribe it as text. So it's really not creating any new knowledge. When we get to knowledge transforming, this is when students plan their content in accordance with rhetorical, communicative, and pragmatic constraints. So their goals are to create knowledge, to analyze a problem, to plan content and rhetoric. So it becomes a much more sophisticated type of writing with the goal in mind of creating knowledge or transforming knowledge rather than just telling about something they already know. So in a book report, you'd be knowledge telling, but in an analysis of a text, you'd be knowledge transforming. And this is the knowledge telling model if you want to think about what is a model, since that is a difficult concept sometimes. So this just kind of lays out all of the things I just talked about in a more tangible way. Give you a second to take a look at it. So this is knowledge telling. And I want you to think as you're looking at this about how this could be modified to become knowledge transforming. Instead, so this part where it says retrieve content from memory using probes. What could that say instead of retrieve content from memory? That might be something like read something new, analyze a text, collaborate with a partner. So those kinds of things would get us from knowledge telling to knowledge transforming. And like I said, this text was really influential. A lot of things have built on it, and there are other models. So this Bereder and Scardomalia piece that this came out of actually was then responded to by Hayes, and in the response, Hayes talked about some different models that come out of the Bereder and Scardomalia piece. So the first is the flexible focus model. So the students are given the writing task, they focus on it, they develop a focus. So if the writing task is to write about your summer, the focus would be the time they went to camp for the first time in their lives. They're going to comment on the focus. So what was so special about going to camp for the first time? Add to the text. Some exciting thing happened, whatever. The text isn't done, go back to make another comment on the focus, add to it, and then be done. So this is really what we do as like a 5-paragraph essay type of thing with young writers. The fixed topic model, very similar. The difference is it's going to be provided often for the students. So a lot of times you'll see this as students get a little older and they're given a topic to argue on. So maybe you're going to be pro gun control and you'll be against gun control. Probably in early elementary or upper elementary, you wouldn't do that topic, but hopefully you get my point. They're given a fixed topic, same thing. Make a comment. Was it on topic? Yes or no? If yes, add to the text. If no, make a different comment. And then if it wasn't enough, continue doing it. Again, really 5-paragraph essay focused, but this gives students a little bit more challenge to address a topic that might be more complex, might require more research, may even require them to argue. And then the topic elaboration model. This will be more common in a discussion setting or something that would allow students to be more collaborative. So let's go back to the gun control discussion. When it says topic stack, there's going to be different ideas that you could talk about. You may build on other people's ideas. So it would start with a very rudimentary understanding of whatever the topic is, and then they'll elaborate on it, they'll make comments on whatever the current topic is, and then continue to add to understanding until the topic has been exhausted. So this requires a lot more problem solving, and it also requires students to be able to think critically, and if you're doing it in real time in a discussion format, they will have to be really prepared, they'll have to think on their feet. So these are all different models, but the topic elaboration model is going to be quite a bit more knowledge generating than the other two. Flexible focus model is going to be really knowledge telling. Fixed topic will be a lot of knowledge telling, might have a little bit of knowledge generation, and then the transformational one would really lie in the topic elaboration model. This is a very basic understanding of these, and it's not really giving you a ton to work with, but I'm hopeful that you can see how these theories have evolved over time to get to a point where they're more tangible and there's more to them. Okay, and then the Barretter-Scartamalia, just summary. It built on Hayes and includes intermediate stages, which those models I showed you are kind of a physical representation of the intermediate stages. But again, it doesn't really address how novice writers become more competent. There's nothing about how teachers can foster those skills. And that's where the self-regulation theory comes in. So Zimmerman and Reisenberg really focused on self-regulation in writing. They talked about specific mechanisms through which writers learn and grow, and there were 3 self-regulatory behaviors that they focused on: controlling actions, controlling the writing environment, and controlling internal thought processes. So if you read later in the article, there's more elaboration on what these strategies are, what does this look like, but in this part, it's just an overview. And to me, a strategy that encourages self-regulation is going to require the teacher to let go of some control. This was in the late 90s. This was pretty revolutionary. If you went to school in the 90s, you probably had a lot of time sitting in rows with the teacher at the board. This is giving students a lot more control over their own learning and also a lot more peer interaction. Their job is to monitor the strategies they're using, evaluate if they're effective, and react to them. And they'll get rid of, not use anymore, the strategies that didn't work for them, and then they'll retain the strategies that did. And these strategies are meant to help writers exert control over their own writing, believe in their own competence, and allow them to acquire new self-regulatory behaviors. That's the goal of this model. And then the last one is the domain learning, which is attributed to Alexander. And I actually see these two as really connected because this Alexander's domain learning is influenced by self-regulatory strategies or behaviors, but also knowledge and motivation. So I think this part was the most confusing of the 5 theories. And that's because I don't think they were clear about the fact that there are 3 things that go into writing development: strategic behaviors or strategies, your knowledge, and your motivation, which is connected to self-regulation. So what strategies do you have? What do you know? And how motivated are you to share what you know with others? So in these knowledge, strategies, and motivation, or through them, you are developing writing skills or not. So if you have a lot of knowledge, if you know a lot of strategies, if you are motivated, you will develop as a writer. If you're not, you will not develop as quickly. So it really depends on how much of these things you have, how much knowledge, how many strategies, how motivated, how long have you been in school, how much each attribute, knowledge, strategies, or motivation affects your performance. It really depends on what class you're in. And then most importantly for school, how instruction is designed. If instruction allows you to regulate your own writing and your own growth, you probably are going to be more motivated to write. If instruction is very controlling, you may not be motivated. So that's how motivation is really correlated to writing performance. Okay, so you've thought of all of these, or thought about all these 5 theories. Take some time to make sure you really understand them. I'll send you the PowerPoint in addition to the video so that you can have it, because I think it's really helpful to just have these really brief bullet points to remember what the theories are. But I want you to think about the theories we just reviewed, which ones you're most interested in, and how they relate to the various assessments we've been discussing over the past few weeks. How motivated are students to engage in these assessments? Are they just knowledge telling, or are they knowledge transforming? So think about the theories we've talked about, think about how they're related to assessment, and then you'll get more communication from me about what to do for teamwork this week. But I hope this was helpful to you in understanding the reading.